If you know somebody long enough, sooner or later, you will be disappointed in them. They're going to do something that causes you to say, oh, I wish he hadn't said that, or I'm disappointed that he did that. Even the best work colleagues are going to do that to you. Loving parents, spouses, church leaders, neighbors, friends. It is inevitable, isn't it? We all sin, we all fall short of the glory of God, and sooner or later we're going to see that in everyone, no matter how impressed we might have been with them. And if you've not seen it, then you just don't know everything about them yet, or you've not known them for long enough. And that's also true of Bible figures. So Moses, wonderful hero by the power of God, but then there's that time when he's frustrated with the complaining people, he loses his temper, he disobeys God at the rock. Gideon, who did so much good for God's people, ends up setting up the golden ephod, an idol, which becomes a snare for Israel. Think of Eli the priest, who failed to restrain his sons from their greed and sexual immorality at the temple. How should we react when the person we're reading about in the Bible is one who is marked out explicitly as chosen and anointed by the Lord as king of his people? What do we do when we realize that this man is meant to be the pattern of the anointed one? Like Saul, chosen by God, anointed to be king, and yet ends up turning away from the Lord and being replaced by David. And then David, who so far in this book has deeply impressed us. Surely it's only a matter of time before we get to this chapter and we're disappointed. Messiahs with a small m, anointed ones. Even the flawed ones, they do point us to the Messiah, but they're not sinless. Maybe because they're not sinless, they actually keep us looking forward. Surely there's got to be another. Surely we're still waiting for the one in whom there was no sin. And sometimes in an account of the failure of an Old Testament anointed one, there's someone else in the same story who shows us the better way. Someone else who's more like the Messiah than the Messiah figure. Young Samuel in the account of Eli and his wicked sons. And here, Abigail in a story in which David disappoints. How can the Old Testament still teach us about the Messiah when even someone like David falls short of the glory of God? Well, by showing us Abigail, who restrains David and trains the Messiah as she covers over her husband's sin and turns away David's wrath. So let's go back to the beginning of the chapter, see what happens. And first of all, we're confronted with a wicked fool who provokes wrath. Nabal and Abigail, husband and wife, are introduced for us in verse 2 and 3. A certain man in Maon who had property there at Carmel was very wealthy. He had 1,000 goats and 3,000 sheep, which he was shearing in Carmel. His name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. She was an intelligent and beautiful woman, but her husband, a Calebite, presuming that means a descendant of Caleb and therefore an Israelite, he was surly and mean in his dealings. We're told later on that his name means fool or senseless, worthless. I'm guessing his parents didn't give him that name at birth, but it was presumably some kind of nickname that that became attached to him. So you know that famous verse, Psalm 14, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. That word fool in the Hebrew is the word Nabal. And that term fool is in the Bible, it doesn't just mean stupid, it means morally culpable. Abigail later calls him wicked. We see in verse 2 he's very wealthy. He has these huge flocks, Later on in the chapter, he's holding a banquet in his house like that of a king. Verse 3, he has an intelligent and beautiful wife. He has every reason to be thankful and joyful and generous. But instead, verse 3 tells us that he's surly or harsh and mean in his dealings with people. He is this self-indulgent man who seems to relish getting into an argument with others. And I think we're left saying, how sad and how wicked. And so when David, you remember David is on the run from Saul. He has 600 men who've gathered around him, who someone is responsible for feeding and clothing. David sends 10 of his young men to Nabal to ask for a favor, to ask for help. And we learn that David and his men have been looking out for the servants of Nabal as they care for the sheep in that area. And David and his men have made sure that they didn't take anything from Nabal's men or the flocks. In fact, they've protected them. They've been like a wall around Nabal's men. And it's now sheep shearing time, an intense part of the year. The men and the flocks all gather in one place. And it naturally also becomes a time for feasting together. And so it was the right time for David to go and to send people to ask Nabal for help. And it was a reasonable request given all that David had done for him. And politely made. Look at verse 6. A reasonable time to ask for whatever Nabal can spare in the way of food and drink. Now, Nabal could have said no politely, but instead he insults David and his men and humiliates them. Verse 10. Nabal answered David's servants, "Who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse? Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. Why should I take my bread and water and the meat I have slaughtered for my shearers and give it to men coming from who knows where?" He demeans David. He suggests he's a nobody, just a servant on the run from his master, another one of the untrustworthy young men of the time, as he might have put it. But David, of course, is far more than just Saul's servant on the run. He is the Lord's anointed. He will one day be king. Abigail certainly knew that. Surely her husband Nabal knew it as well. And if he knew it, why was he not afraid to scorn his future king like this? He's acting as foolishly as Saul, who knows that David will be king and yet still pursues him in his jealous fury. And so, verse 12, David's men go back and report every one of Nabal's words to David. David is not going to stand for this. 400 of his men put on their swords, intending to repay Nabal for his arrogant and rude tight-fistedness, and to do that by killing him and all the men in his household. Well, Nabal certainly deserved that, but what about all his men? And what about all the terrible suffering that this is going to inflict on the wives and the children of Nabal's men? Was there not a way to punish Nabal without such a slaughter? We're going to come back to the rights and the wrongs of the way that David responded. Just before we move on, here's a couple of things we might take to heart. Don't be like Nabal. If the Lord has given you plenty, then be thankful and be generous. Because sadly, having plenty can make us the kind of worried people who don't like to share. Being successful can make us proud and arrogant. Having power can make us shouty and harsh, spoiling for a fight. And if we are tempted down any of those roads, then we need to ask the Lord for gratitude and humility not to become like Nabal. And secondly, don't fret when others are like Nabal towards you. It is horrible, isn't it, to ask someone nicely and to get a rebuke. It is not nice to do good to someone and to be repaid with evil. And David has been treated that way by Saul again and again. But up to now, he's restrained his anger. He's restrained his desire for revenge. And I think we're left wondering, why was it that David doesn't show here that same faith in God, that same calmness when he's provoked by Nabal? Maybe there are times when we need to ask the Lord for grace to be able to respond to ill treatment, to be able to respond to the Nabals in our life as well. A wicked fool provokes wrath, terrifying wrath. We really need someone here to rescue the situation, and we have that because a wise woman covers over sin and turns away wrath. One of the servants, verse 14, tells Abigail about her husband's harsh words and what he did when he sent David's servants away and the danger that they are in. Verse 17, the servant says to Abigail, "Think it over and see what you can do, because disaster is hanging over our master and his whole household. He is such a wicked man that no one can talk to him." Abigail immediately sees the danger and she acts to save her household. She acts secretly. She does it all behind her husband's back. She loads onto donkeys 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, probably holding many gallons of wine in each, 5 dressed sheep, 5 bushels of roasted grain, 100 raisin cakes, and 200 fig cakes. I'm guessing she took some servants to help with the donkeys, but surely this was still an extraordinary thing, an extraordinarily brave thing for her to do, for her to set out towards David, knowing or guessing his anger at her husband. We read back in verse 3 that Abigail is intelligent. The word means wise or discerning or sensible, and beautiful. Some might be uncomfortable with the Bible mentioning her beauty at this point. What's it got to do with anything in the story? But woman is the glory of man, and the beauty of women is part of God's design. And Abigail's outward beauty, which is noted, matches her inward beauty. As someone has said, she is beautiful, brainy, and brave. And she's on a mission. And sure enough, as she begins to ride up into a mountain ravine, David and his 400 armed men are coming down towards her. And if she wasn't a little bit scared at that point, I would be surprised. And David, we're told, has just been going over the injustice of it all. He and his men had watched over Nabal's men and flocks in the desert for nothing. Verse 21, he says, "He's paid me back evil for good. And with an oath, he's just promised that he will not leave alive to the morning one male of all that Nabal has." And here's Nabal's wife, and some of the servants leading the donkeys laden with provisions heading towards him. It's the scene that's pictured here on the screen. What do you think about Abigail deceiving her husband and taking the goods that he has very clearly said he does not want to be given to David? I think because we've grown up marinated in the feminist assumptions of our age, it probably seems no big deal to us, but it ought to be. Feminism may seem to be a good thing, the fight against the unjust treatment of women, but actually it is the attempt to dispense with the differences between men and women that God intended in creation, or in some cases to dispense with men altogether. And in kicking back against the Creator, which I think we've all been caught up in this, what we find is that inevitably brings slavery and misery to both men and women. If you want to think that through a bit more, there's a book sitting over there, The Essence of Feminism by Kirsten Burkett, which is well worth reading. Abigail is definitely not a feminist. She knows, with all the holy women of the past, as Peter writes in his letter, that she's commanded to respect and obey her husband, to submit to him. So why does she disobey him here? We need to see that God gives us laws, but he qualifies his own laws. They're not wooden. So, for example, Paul writes in Colossians, "Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord." And yet that is in a Bible that tells us that we must obey God above everyone else. And so the everything doesn't include some things. For example, if a parent tells their child to steal something, the child has a duty to obey God above their parents. So you need to read a command like "Children, obey your parents in everything" wisely. Romans 13, everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities. That has to be read alongside Peter and John's response when the Sanhedrin told them to stop teaching about Jesus. Here are the governing authorities giving them a command. And they say, Acts 4:19, "Judge for yourselves whether it is right in God's sight to obey you rather than God." And Abigail here shows us that wives must sometimes disobey their husbands and sometimes should be honored for that, as she is. She doesn't do this out of a self-centered rebellion or a rejection of God's purposes for men and women in marriage. She does it to protect her family, in fact, the whole household, from her husband's idiotic behavior. And she's commended and honored for it. And so, to what I think is the central part of the whole chapter, Abigail's words, her speech to David from verse 23. I'm going to read it again. Judith, you read it wonderfully, but they're such wonderful words, I think they deserve to be read again. Just as I do, get ready to notice the respect and honor that she shows to David, the Lord's anointed. Notice how she takes the blame herself for what's happened. Notice how she distances herself from the folly of her husband. Notice how she rebukes David. She does it very subtly, but she does rebuke him for his plan to avenge. She says it is good that the Lord has restrained him because, if you like, vengeance belongs to the Lord. She asks for forgiveness. She shows that she knows all about David being hunted by Saul, but she reassures David that the Lord is going to protect him. It's that lovely phrase, that the Lord will keep him in the bundle of the living. And she ends up building up David's faith by reminding him that he will ascend to the throne and he will be given a lasting dynasty. It's the first mention of that in the Bible. And then finally she asks David to remember her when he comes into his kingdom. Verse 23. When Abigail saw David, she quickly got off her donkey and bowed down before David with her face to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, "My Lord, let the blame be on me alone. Please let your servant speak to you. Hear what your servant has to say. May my Lord pay no attention to that wicked man Nabal. He's just like his name. His name is Fool, and folly goes with him. But as for me, your servant, I didn't see the men my master sent. Now, since the Lord has kept you, my master, from bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hands, as surely as the Lord lives and as you live, may your enemies and all who intend to harm my master be like Nabal. And let this gift which your servant has brought to my master be given to the men who follow you. Please forgive your servant's offense, for the Lord will certainly make a lasting dynasty for my master, because he fights the Lord's battles. Let no wrongdoing be found in you as long as you live. Even though someone is pursuing you to take your life, the life of my master will be bound securely in the bundle of the living by the Lord your God. But the lives of your enemies he will hurl away as from the pocket of a sling. When the Lord has done for my master every good thing he promised concerning him and has appointed him leader over Israel, my master will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed or of having avenged himself. And when the Lord has brought my master success, remember your servant." What wonderful words. wise words, words full of faith. Abigail covers over her husband's sin. She turns away David's wrath. She's willing to take the blame herself. She asks for forgiveness. She tells David that his anger wasn't good, and the slaughter of all Nabal's men would have been a stain on his hands and a weight on his conscience for the rest of his life. David, through most of his life, does show what a good and righteous king is like. He does prepare God's people for the arrival of the Anointed One, the Messiah. But David is sinful. There's no one righteous, not even one. And God's people, as they see the life of David, should be in no doubt that the promised seed of Abraham, through whom all the nations of the world will be blessed, it's not David. It's going to be a descendant of David. As far as this chapter goes, the Messiah needs to be more like Abigail than David, someone who steps forward to bravely take responsibility for another's sin, someone who puts themselves in danger to be a peacemaker and to save their household from death, someone who is wise and discerning, someone who knows the promises of the Lord and believes that they will all be fulfilled, someone who's going to allow the Nabals of the world to revile without always taking revenge. We should thank God that Jesus is better than David. Well, we've seen the actions and the attitudes of Nabal and of David and of Abigail. But these final verses, looking at verse 32 onwards, are going to remind us that behind all this, it is the Lord who's working out his purposes. The Lord restrains David. The Lord strikes down Nabal. The Lord raises up Abigail. Verse 32 to 35, I think Abigail must have feared that David and his 400 men would not be stopped in their anger, but would trample them down and just continue on their way. Instead, we have this breathtaking back down from David. Amazing forgiveness. Verse 32, David said to Abigail, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you today to meet me. May you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself with my own hands." David recognizes that the Lord is behind Abigail's arrival. She's been sent by him to keep him from needless bloodshed. And David also recognizes, verse 36 to 39, that the Lord has brought down Nabal's wrongdoing on his own head. When Abigail tells Nabal the next day about what she did to turn away the wrath of David, his heart fails him, presumably a description of a heart attack. Was the heart attack triggered by Abigail's words, perhaps when he realized just how close he and all his men had come to being wiped out? Was the heart attack triggered by realizing how much of his food Abigail has just given away? "You gave David what?" His final words. Well, either way, it is the Lord's doing. That's what David recognizes. Verse 39. When David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, "Praise be to the Lord, who has upheld my cause against Nabal for treating me with contempt. He's kept his servant from doing wrong and has brought Nabal's wrongdoing down on his own head." These acts of the Lord are recognized to be gracious and righteous. And finally, Abigail is blessed and raised up. Her fool of a husband is no more, and she doesn't hesitate to leave her home and join David when he sends for her to join him as his wife. I'm going to leave aside the question of David having more than one wife. It was normal for kings at the time. It's not condemned in this narrative. But what's going on here is Abigail is coming from being under this fool Nabal to being under the loving protection of God's anointed one. Of course, at this moment, David is an outlaw. He's on the run. He's living in caves and forests. So I don't know what her early married life looked like. A bit like marrying someone who's only got a tent. But she believes, and she's absolutely certain, that one day her new husband will be king. and she too will be blessed in him. So the Old Testament does teach us about the Messiah who's coming. And it continues to do that even when David falls short. Instead, it gives us this picture of Abigail, the noble woman who restrains David and ends up directing him, training him, as she covers over Nabal's sin and turns away David's wrath, and then comes under his loving protection. Praise God for Abigail and for all noble and wise women, and praise God for his righteous and gracious acts. Amen.